Sonic
Lab
TV.
Hello and welcome to Sonic Lab, and today I'm very proud to be able to bring you the Yamaha Tenori-On. This is Yamaha's brand new instrument. It's very futuristic. This is the size of it. It's essentially, if you have been living under a rock for the last 6 months or so, it's a 16-step, 16-channel music sequencer, I suppose is a simple way of putting it. It's created by a chap called Toshio Iwai, who is a major sort of multimedia art star in Japan, and it's very much a sort of stylish kind of construction. This has been in development for a very long time, and it's kind of supposed to represent a kind of new way of inputting music and creating music. I mean, it's quite sort of left field, I'll be perfectly frank with you, but it's created a massive buzz on all the forums. People have been eagerly awaiting it for quite some time. So what I'm going to do is, we've actually already filmed an interview with the chap who was charged with actually putting the thing together in collaboration with Toshio Iwai, and he's sort of told us a bit more about all the individual functions of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a quick look and just sort of get a handle on some of the other functions which interested me, specifically the sampling and also the MIDI functions. What does it feel like? This is actually it's sort of a metallicized plastic kind of feel. It's quite heavy, although it has actually already got the batteries in, so it adds a little bit of the weight. I wouldn't say people have been sort of speculating on how rugged the construction is. I mean, I wouldn't want to drop it on a concrete floor or anything, but it does feel sort of quite reasonable, and it also is quite a nice fit in the hand. I don't know if you can hear that shaking. That's the one thing that's a little bit disconcerting, but what that actually is the plastic covers to the lights on the back of the device. So looking at the front panel here, obviously we've got 16 by 16 backlit LED buttons, same on the back, except they're not actually buttons, they just light up. For controlling and accessing the parameters, we've got 5 sort of surface mount flush buttons here, which are L5s, which are the L buttons. And then on the right hand side we've got the right buttons, which are another 5. The right hand side generally access layer switching, BPM, kind of the more sort of global functions, whereas the left hand side buttons tend to sort of have something to do with what's going on a specific layer. Further functions down here you access using the scroll wheel, and these are sort of setting up things like effects, screensaver, file preferences, quantization, that kind of stuff. This button here gives you the ability to clear a specific layer. Touch it once to clear the layer, hold it down, it clears the entire song. These two chaps here are the speakers, which are, fairly rudimentary, to be perfectly honest. They're not terribly loud, but they're enough to get you going if you haven't got a pair of headphones. On the back, we have the SD card, which will take SD cards which allow you to load your samples in. In fact, the Tenori-On comes with a utility on the CD that allows you to create user voices, so you can load your samples in that way. On the bottom, the connections are headphones, which is a 1/4-inch mini jack. This is the sort of mini DIN, which gives you the MIDI connections. Then you've got the recessed standby control, and there's the power just there. Now, the first thing that struck me about this was, obviously, if I'm going to be using this thing, I'm going to be holding it sort of fairly close at lap level. If I've got headphones and MIDI and stuff coming out, seems to be in the wrong place, as far as I can tell. Surely it would be better to have put the connections at the top where the wires would have been out of the way. You could sort of tape them down the side or whatever, so that it would just be less likelihood of you snapping them off. So it just seems like kind of a strange choice. If I just turn this on, I'll get it rolling. You can see I've got the loop counter showing up here. It's exactly the same on this side as well. So that's giving me my first 16 loop. It's quite clever in the way that it works, because what you actually are able to do is you've got 16 steps per layer and 16 layers, but you can actually set the length of a layer. So a layer could be 12 if you wanted a kind of triplet feel, but then again the layer above that could be a 16 beat layer, or it could be 2. So you've got sort of quite a lot of flexibility for running sort of concentric patterns. The other thing that's quite nice is there's a thing called blocks. Now a block is 16 steps, and you can have up to 16 blocks. So for instance, you could have 16 patterns that would be selectable. So I've got a simple pattern here. I'm just going to copy this to block 3 and to block 2. In block 2, I'm going to put a fill. So I flick tracks between there. I just put my fill in, copy that to block 3. I'm going to drop the bass drum out. So you can see how quickly I can build up variations. Very nice. The block selection system, you don't seem to be able to chain them so they will play sequentially. You'd have to select them on the fly, which is a little bit strange. And also, when you select a new block, it starts playing it from where the step you were in the previous block. So you can't sort of chain one block to another and sort of flip between them, which maybe missed a trick, I think, a little bit there, because you could have a sort of chain up performance type stuff with it. Although you can't chain patterns together and sort of structure things in terms of songs and play them as is, there is a feature called song recording, and what that does is record all of the movements that you make on the Tenori-On. So that's block switching, changing voices, volume changes, transposing, all of that kind of stuff, and then you can save each of those intrinsic performances as a song onto your SD card. So you can actually make quite a kind of long and involved performance and save that and name it as a song on the SD card. So there is a way around. There is a downside to this. One thing is, as soon as you press start, it goes. So there's no kind of 1, 2, 3. A counting would be nice, or at least an optional counting would be very useful. But it does mean that you can actually create quite long and involved performances using the Tenori-On. One of the things about Tenori-On that is kind of quite fascinating to people who are perhaps doing dance music and electronic music of whatever kind is the ability to trigger and load your own samples onto the device. There are 3 user voices, user 1, 2 and 3. Each of those has 16 sample slots. So you can put up to, 32, 48 samples actually on board. Each of these samples is limited to about 990 milliseconds, which is just under a second. So it's kind of quite ideally suited to drum sounds and what have you. Given the fact that the drum sounds on the Tenori-On aren't perhaps what you call sort of contemporary cutting edge drum sounds, or even sort of 909s or dance orientated, I thought this would be quite a good idea to have a go. So I've got my SD card. I also need a card reader, because obviously not every computer does have that, so I'm going to pop that in there and I'm going to save some voices. So first of all, I've launched the Tenori-On Voice User Manager on my Mac here. It also runs on Windows XP, so you're not going to have too much trouble. You should be able to launch it. All you need to be able to do is obviously access some kind of SD card reader writer. And I've got 16 slots here. Each of them are empty. I'm going to go to my Finder. I've got a bunch of 909 sounds that I quite fancy getting in here, so I'm just going to drop a couple of bass drums in. Then I'm going to find my snares. Let's see, I fancy a bit of snares. Again, just drop them in. Very straightforward, really, and you keep going until you've filled up your entire slots. Then I make the user voice. Now, as you can see, my SD card has slowed up here, so I'm just going to name that. Taking the card out, popping it in the back of the Tenori-On, and I'm good to go. Once I've put my SD card in there, it's a simple matter of going to the File menu, looking at the rather Japanesely titled Samplings menu, and loading my voices that are stored on the SD card into the user slots. It does take quite a while to load them for the first time, but once they're in and the SD card's there, you don't have to do it each time you turn the machine on, which is quite nice. I would like to have seen a little bit more editing on the voice, certainly on the user voices at the very least, because obviously if I put a load of drum sounds in there, you know, the relative levels are going to be a bit off, and I might want to kind of turn things down or up or whatever. You know, I have none of that flexibility. In fact, the only editing I can do to the user voice is shorten it. I can't even transpose anything, so you can't do any clever stuff with, you know, putting samples in very sped up and then sort of slowing them down to get a longer length out of them effectively. So again, a bit of a shame, but perfect for drum sounds. Maybe if you cut breaks, you could use that as well, like sort of recycle style. The individual slices would work as long as they were shorter. But again, you only get 3 of those sample sets, but I suppose if you've got 16, you could do 2/8 across a single user voice. So, you know, you're going to have to work with it a little bit, not very sophisticated. But one thing I did find, as soon as you put your own, you know, even just a 909 in there, it suddenly becomes really, really useful, and you could start using it in a kind of drum machine, pattern drum machine kind of style, and that's where it really worked for me. Tenori-On MIDI implementation is somewhat rudimentary, but it does actually have it, so you can use the Tenori-On to output MIDI. Each layer has its own MIDI channel, 16 layers, 16 MIDI channels, fairly straightforward. I've got it hooked up to the GeForce Oddity here, just plugging it in. I'm transmitting that on channel 1, so I'll just play that. The only real change I can make to it is the length of the note, really. I can't transpose the octave or anything, really. What the Tenori-On outputs is note information. That's very basic stuff. It just gives you there's the MIDI channel here, the note, and the length. There's also some system exclusive there, which I'm not quite sure what that's for. I don't know if that's going to clog anything up, but it's fairly basic. As far as coming the other way, the Tenori-On will receive MIDI. Again, the MIDI implementation is fairly basic. Whatever channel you're transmitting on will correspond to the sound within that layer. It doesn't respond to any kind of meaningful controller information, which is a bit of a shame. Not even modulation, which I would have kind of quite liked to see, particularly for those kind of ambient layery stuff. You might want a bit of mod in there, but no, there's no real modification of the voices even via MIDI there. So overall, I actually quite enjoyed Tenori-On. I thought it was a good fun to use, particularly once you loaded your own samples in there. You could kind of get it for drum machines and what have you. The other side of it, for sort of ambient and kind of more sort of freeform stuff, was also, it's very sort of addictive. It's kind of a bit like a game in a lot of ways. So you sort of find yourself just kind of constantly just involved in sort of like Tetris, I suppose, which is in some ways very good, but in other ways it might be a bit of a sort of time black hole. If you want to sort of pick it up and use it for a specific function, then it might not be the thing. But certainly for coming up with unique and interesting ways of inputting information, coming up with stuff that you wouldn't ordinarily do via a keyboard, it sort of breaks maybe that sort of creative staleness. That would be a very useful function for it. A few things that are a bit disappointing. I am a bit disappointed about the voices. I was expecting better. There's not really any kind of good basic kind of bass sounds or synth sounds. There's a few nice pads and there's lots of very short staccato stuff. So I was a little bit surprised that they hadn't got more going on in the sounds department. Do I think it's worth the $599 UK price? That's a hard one to say. I mean, I think if I was looking for a unique and new way of inputting things, I might take a punt on it. But if I had little money to spend and I needed something that would actually perform specific functions, I might not go for it. I think it's probably a little bit overpriced. Having said that, it's a new instrument. You know, at the moment, the first run, we're told, or as we understand, are sort of practically hand-built. So, you know, you're getting a pretty good deal. I mean, if you were going to any sort of boutique electronic place and they were hand-building you something, it would cost you a fortune. Having said that, the software is upgradable. You will no doubt see iterations. This is after all only version 1, so I think the sequencer will be enhanced in a number of ways. I can see that happening. And presumably the layer types and stuff can all be moved around. So worth buying into if you want something sort of fun and unique to play with that might give you a slightly different angle on playing music.